Thomas Amundrud will now come to the stage and announce and introduce our plenary speaker for this morning. Thomas, take it away.
Thank you, Wayne. So good morning, everyone. I'm Thomas Amundrud. I'm the former president, now the membership chair for the Kyoto chapter of JALT, and I'm also a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DEI committee. And I was also really happy to help in the plenary process, which Adi, who you just saw, led. So before we start this morning, I just want to say a brief word of thanks to all of the volunteers behind the scenes that are making this event happen. Especially all the staff that are keeping this event online and dealing with all of the inevitable glitches. Okay, I know, like myself, I'm sure all of you dealt with the slowness yesterday and it got fixed, and hopefully today will be much better. I just want to say thank you very much to all the volunteers and for continuing that hard work. And thank you for making this happen, literally. So our first speaker this morning is Professor Makiko Deguchi. Professor Deguchi is a professor of social psychology at Sophia University in Tokyo. And as she will discuss, she's recently returned to Japan following an extensive academic career, both as a student and as an academic in the United States. Her current research interests include the impact of social oppression on the psychology of both advantaged and disadvantaged group members, factors that lead to people taking collective action, and qualitative research on life histories of people who become allies of minority groups. Her topic today, which I and no doubt many others of you are very interested to hear, is what is Japanese privilege? A privilege contract in a Japanese context. So Professor Deguchi, take it away, please.
Okay, thank you so much for your introduction. I would like to now share my screen. So first of all, I just wanted to congratulate everyone on an amazing conference. I'm just very impressed with the technology and how easy it is to navigate, the different programs. So I just wanted to say congratulations and thank you for inviting me. I served as the president of CTAR Japan from 2017 until just this past March. And I know that we share a lot of members, and so I hope that we can continue exchanges and collaboration in the future. Okay, so today my topic is about privilege, and I really wanted to apply the concept of privilege to the Japanese context. Typically, when we talk about diversity and multicultural education in Japan, it's really focused on understanding the minorities. What can we learn more about these people? But today, I want to take a different approach. Let's look at the dominant group, right, who possess privilege. In this case, it's the Japanese. And I believe that awareness of one's positionality and privilege, which are often very difficult to see, is essential in achieving a diverse and inclusive society. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And so when I ask my students at Sophia, have you ever used the word privilege in conversations? And in Japanese, the word is tokken. Okay, and the Japanese usage is kind of different, perhaps from maybe the U.S. context or the English context. Students say, well, it's a student's privilege to receive student discounts, or easy access to Tokyo Disneyland is a privilege for local residents. Okay? It's a college student's privilege to have so much free time. Okay, or I learned about privileged class in history class. And there's always something to do with women. It's a women's privilege to not have to pay for a dinner on a date, that kind of thing, which I usually end up explaining that it's actually benevolent sexism. It's not female privilege. But in any case, I think the Japanese students, when they use privilege, it often is about, it's given to people with sort of temporary status, like I'm temporarily a student now. I may happen to live, in Chiba, that kind of thing. I also found the word tokken used in a YouTube video recently, so I took a picture of it. It's Mochimaru Diary. It's a really cute cat. I don't know if some of you already have seen this, but it says here now, even if Mochimaru is being a lazy, like an old geezer, okay, he has the privilege of getting away with it, right? So people who are good looking, cute, can get away with a lot of things. So it's sort of in Japan, it's used in kind of a lookism kind of aspect. the definition that I use within the social justice education paradigm is unearned access to social power based on membership in a dominant social group. Okay, and the key here is that it's not an advantage, gained through effort. Okay, but it's more sort of given automatically by just belonging to that group with the dominant identities. So, is there any benefits that you all may given by being male in Japan or being born Japanese in Japan? Okay, that kind of thing. I tend to like to use this automatic sliding door to describe privilege because privilege is, kind of hard to grasp. So I kind of think of it as, when you want to go from point A to point B, right, and you're just walking, all these doors are sort of opening for you forward. And because it happens all the time, each door opens consistently every time, the person going through doesn't recognize or realize that these doors exist or that they are opening for them. Okay, so that's why it's really hard for people who have privilege to recognize that they have privilege because they don't see it. It becomes their everyday life, everyday scenery. However, if you are in a minority group or have minority identities, you might notice that some doors are shut. Okay, and sometimes you have to, pry open the door yourself or run and to look for the key, which then delays you, or the door may not budge at all. Okay. And the person standing here might look to the side and see that doors are opening for other people, and the other people keep moving forward. And so for this person, they acknowledge that there is a door, that the door is open or closed, depending on who it is. Okay, so they have the understanding of privilege that way. The person who has gone through, these doors and all the way on, on top of these stairs, might be looking down and going, "Hey, what are you guys doing here? Come, just come on over." Really well-intentioned, right? Without any sort of, bad feelings. They really want to see everybody up here, but they don't see the barriers that prevent the person from moving forward. Okay. So the question becomes, okay, why does the door open for some people and why for not others? And so clearly, right, there's something going on here, which is the censor. Okay. And today's talk is trying to also figure out, what is the censor? And, how can we change the censor to become more inclusive? And although I kind of used an individual person metaphor here, okay, typically privilege works in masses, right? So there's like a group of people who go through these invisible doors together. Right? And because you're going through it together, it's harder for you to think that you're different, right? Everybody else next to you seems pretty much similar, identities, right? You don't think you're particularly special or privileged. And when we think about our, dominant or subordinated identities, okay, so these list of identities are typically the identities that we think of when we think about discrimination and oppression. And it's often good to sort of step back and reflect on your own identity. Do you have more dominant identities in terms of these 7 right, categories here, or are you in the subordinated category? When I think about myself, in terms of gender, I am in the female because I'm in the subordinated category for being a woman, but every other category, I'm in the dominant group. So, I do consider myself to be on the side of sort of a super majority or do majority in Japanese. And, the fact that I have a PhD, I'm a college professor, that I am a, fluent English speaker in Japan is, warrants me a lot of privilege. Now, if you are, if people happen to have a lot of these dominant identities, the point here is that it means something, right? That your experience kind of going through those doors is different from people with multiple subordinated identities. But I think it's also important to remember that, we all have both dominant and subordinated identities. There are more than, there are, endless lists of identities that we can go over. And I'm sure you'll find one in which you are a subordinated or dominant. Okay. Oh, so today, we're going to focus on the Japanese people in Japan. Okay. In Japanese education system, when I asked my college students, what did you learn about discrimination, like growing up? Okay. They always say, 差別をしてはいけないと学びました. We should not discriminate against others. Okay. So it looks like, this is something that is ingrained in the Japanese people. Okay. But it's sort of like the thinking stops there. There's no other full investigation of that idea. And I think that, in Japan, the education system presents the problem of discrimination only at the individual level. So there are sort of, bad people in the world who discriminate other people. That's because they are the bad apples. Just don't be the bad apples and you'll be fine. Okay. Omoiyari, right? Think of other people. But we don't teach discrimination on the structural and institutional levels. And that's, quite problematic because I come from a psychology background. When I teach in my classes, I always talk about, there are 3 forms of discrimination. And one is the interpersonal discrimination, which is when it's a person to person, right? Discrimination. This one is easy to sort of imagine. It's easy to teach. People sort of get this one. And this is the one that's been taught predominantly in Japan. However, the greater, structure that has more power is the institutional discrimination. And this occurs, in governing bodies, law, education, medicine, politics, government, media. So, so these are happen on the institutional level. So even if individuals in these institutions are good people and well-intentioned, okay, it's very hard to change discriminatory practices, and change happens slowly. It takes a long time for change to happen. And then the third one is cultural discrimination. And this, I think, could be things like value systems that society shares, like stereotypes. It could be, standards of beauty, who's considered beautiful or not. In Japan, I think there's a culture of like, don't just talk about discrimination. If you talk about discrimination, people will then discriminate. So just like hush, hush about it. Okay. Or things like, individual effort is everything, like doroku wa subete, kind of prevents these different levels of discrimination to be visible. So, so in Japan, and not just Japan, but anyone, no one wants to be labeled a racist or somebody who discriminates against other people. And I think what also happens in Japan is that, people think, well, even if I have some kind of prejudicial feelings inside, as long as I don't act on them, like I'm fine, right? And so the quickest and easiest way to avoid the risk of appearing racist or risk of appearing like somebody who discriminates is to avoid contact with people who might be targets of racism or discrimination. So basically minority groups. And it's kind of like, people saying, well, I don't discriminate against Black people because I don't know anyone who's Black. Okay. That kind of idea. And I think this prevents, this kind of leads to people kind of with avoidance behavior. In my classes, I teach a class called Psychology of Discrimination. And I have students do a brainstorm session where they get into groups and say, okay, so, let's just, assume that the people with dominant group and subordinate groups and identities have different experiences. What kind of experience or what kind of different experience do you think they're having? So students will say, well, subordinated groups, minority groups experience discrimination, sense of alienation, seen through stereotypes. So stereotypes is when you're viewed not as an individual, but viewed as the identity, the main identity, the minority identity. So, a woman, a female so-and-so, a female doctor, versus Dr. So-and-so. I remember, growing up in the United States, Makiko, what do you think, from a Japanese perspective, or what do you think of from an Asian perspective? But I never, heard, Jennifer, who's a white woman sitting next to me, asked Jennifer, what do you think as a white woman? That has never been, raised. And so when you're a minority, you're always seeing through your subordinated identities. these groups experience institutional cultural discrimination, which I'm, even though I'm going through this very quickly, like this is huge. These are all very big things. Same with prejudice, and they're blamed when complaining when they speak. They're blamed as complaining when they speak up against injustice. And I think the key thing here is that a lot of times, not many examples come up on this side of dominant group experiences, right? And I think this is what we want to make visible today in this talk. So if subordinated groups experience discrimination and dominant groups, right, do not experience discrimination on a daily basis, or really don't feel that much alienated on a daily basis, they're not seen through stereotypes, so they're always, it's Deguchi-san, right? Exactly called by your name and seen as a person, as an individual, and do not experience institutional or cultural discrimination, okay? And you are believed when you speak up against injustice. And so the main point that I want to emphasize here is that privilege and oppression are opposite sides of the same coin. It's not that there are like normal people on one side and people who are discriminated, okay? But it's more like there are people who are discriminated, the people who actually gain and have these invisible privileges afforded to them. Okay. So how did I come across the notion of privilege? Well, it happened when I was doing my graduate studies in 1995 in Boston. And in that class, I think I was taking a class called Psychology of Social Oppression. and we had to read Peggy Mcintosh's article called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Okay. And she was, some of you may have heard her name or read her essay, but she was quite instrumental in opening up a dialogue about white privilege in North America. And I was very curious because in this essay, she lists 46 items of white privileges. And I guess, growing up as a minority in the United States, as an Asian person in a predominantly white community, I've always thought, white people were advantaged, but for having a white person admit that was very empowering for me. I was very much inspired by that. But I was also curious, how did Peggy Mcintosh herself, who is white, come to recognize her white privilege? And so I became very interested in that. And this is her story. So in the early 1980s, she was working in a university, and many people recognized that the syllabus or the curriculum was very male-centered. And so she got a grant and basically started up a kind of working group to investigate this. And they were very enthusiastic men and female and women professors who came together once a month for over a year to work on this. But after a year, the female members became very resentful of the male members of the committee. And the female members found the members oppressive. And Peggy, who was the chair of this, was very much, puzzled by this, but also felt really guilty. Like, maybe my leadership skills, weren't, on par. How did this happen? We started off so good. And plus, these men were extremely progressive. They were completely, in agreement about increasing female scholarship and incorporating women's voices in the curriculum. And they were nice, and she basically says, these men are the best we've got. Okay. And so are they oppressive or are they nice? And she went through some of the minutes of the meetings and found that, in fact, there were evidence of men being oppressive, and that, when women said, well, why can't you, have more female scholarships in this part or that part, men were not willing to open up the space. Well, that's, we really can't, take anything out of the curriculum. So the question was, right, are they oppressive or are they nice? At which time she was then called out by women of color. Okay? As a white woman, women of color said, well, white women are oppressive. White feminists are oppressive. And her opinion of herself was, well, I'm a good person. I believe in equal rights for everyone. I'm a feminist fighting for women's rights. I don't consciously discriminate against anyone. I'm a nice person. And she even says, well, I don't see how they could say this about us since we are letting them be part of our group. So this is kind of, her racist, right? Internal voices that came out. And, she says, well, that was where I was at this stage. But I think what was really important for this to happen was that she was able to make links across the types of oppression. So in terms of sexism, right, she was in the minority group, so she can see and understand that men are oppressive, even though men may not think they are. But in terms of racism, right, she was part of the dominant group, okay? And so she was the one that was called out being oppressive. So the important thing here that she was able to do was she was able to believe the non-white people who were calling out white people as oppressive. And so I think one of the takeaways from this is that you can be a nice person and oppressive person at the same time. So she didn't have to choose, right? You can be both. And I think oftentimes we feel like we have to choose. Well, you can still be extremely well-intentioned, a really nice person, and be oppressive if you haven't acknowledged or if you aren't aware of the privileges that you have being in the dominant group. So in the essay that she wrote in 1988, she has a kind of a list of white privileges. I'll read off just a few. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can turn on the television or open to a front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. I can criticize our government and talk about how much I fear its policies and behavior without being seen as a cultural outsider. If my day, week, or year is going badly, I need not ask of each negative episode or situation whether it had racial overtones. Right? So even though these are white privilege lists, I think these can easily be transferred for Japanese people in Japan. And this is kind of the privilege that we gain daily. She writes, as a white person, I had been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but have been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. So when I used to teach this in the United States before I came back to Japan, okay, oftentimes, students will say, well, does this mean, are all white people bad? Are all white people racist? Okay. And I think there's a better way to think about that, which is, what are, white people doing to interrupt racism? Okay. And I can say the same thing for Japanese people in Japan. What are Japanese, so because we already know that, good people can still be oppressive, right? So we don't want to go into this racist, non-racist, good person, bad person dichotomy, okay? We want to sort of stay with, well, what are people doing to interrupt this institutional and cultural oppression? Okay. And one of the useful things that I came across when dealing with this is the racial identity development theory that came out from the US in the 1990s. Okay. This is actually on white racial identity development, and I'll explain it as a white racial identity development, but I do feel very strongly that this can be transferred easily to Japanese racial identity in the context of Japan. So the first stage, so basically Janet Helms's idea is that, we're all at different stages, okay, of development in dealing with our racial identity. So this is for a white person in the context of the US. The first stage contact is when a white person is unaware of institutional racism or their own white privilege. So people who are in this contact stage may say things like, well, I don't see color, I just see you as a person, or, why do people keep mentioning, race, we're all human beings, aren't we? Okay, so that kind of comment will come from somebody here. But quickly, usually there are, history classes or, looking at the news, daily news, there's kind of a disintegration that takes place where a white person may feel shame and anger and guilt at the awareness that they might be privileged or they're on the white side. And however, people don't usually stay in a disintegration. It's kind of a cognitive dissonance stage. It's very uncomfortable. So they typically go back very quickly to a reintegration. This is the societal pressure to accept the status quo. Okay. Well, all this, slavery happened, you know, decades ago, minority people should really stop complaining and get their act together, and then sort of lead to avoid people of color. And some people will stay at this stage for their entire life. Some people might stay in the contact stage for their entire life. But luckily, we have white people who move on to pseudo-independent stage of self-examination. This is where they're like, well, United States is still not, we haven't achieved racial equality. So this is where people want to find out more about people of color and begin question previous definitions of whiteness. And then as they sort of continue to do that, they might reach out to people of color more. And in immersion, right, they're really starting to think about, what does it mean to be white in US society? And what are the prejudices that I have internalized, and how do I unlearn them? Okay. In autonomy stage, they have a newly defined sense of a white person is, they see themselves as committing to anti-racism and anti-oppression in their daily lives. And I think an important part of this autonomy is that they kind of reach an independent stage where they are not doing this social justice work because they want to be praised by minorities, or they're kind of doing it because they feel like this is wrong, and that they want to, this is to fulfill their own sense of moral duty. And what I like about this identity development model is that, again, it moves us away from the racist, non-racist, good person, bad person. I mean, everybody could be really good person in this stage. It's just, how much work have you done, understanding and thinking about your racial identity? And so this can easily be replaced by Japanese, I think, racial identity in Japanese context. And I actually use this model in my classes in Japan, and have Japanese students reflect, so where do you think you are, okay, in these stages? And how did you get there? How do you know that you were in the context stage or the stage? I want some evidence to back it up. So I really make them engage in this theory. What I also like about this theory is that I think everybody, no matter what stage you are, could remember the time where they were in the context stage. Okay, so it's kind of, you kind of have this sense of empathy or compassion for people still here because you were there too. Okay, so not demonizing or villainizing, people who may be in the lower levels of the identity development stage. What I also like about this stage, and I keep going about this stage, but is that each stage, the way the kind of things you may say to a minority, group person, and the way you act kind of is very different at each stage. Okay, so you are actually going through a transformation. You are actually somewhat of a different person, okay, because you're acting very, the word choices, the way you say things, everything, becomes different. Okay. In terms of minorities, do minorities go through the same process? No. Okay, so that was a dominant group. So if you are a part of the minority group, you go through a different process. And this one is a model that came out in 1971 by Bill Cross, the Black Racial Identity Development. There are 5 stages here. A pre-encounter is when a Black person internalizes negative Black stereotypes. This is the starting point. Okay. This is where they, they still want to be part of the mainstream, white group. But they quickly, at quite young age, they experience racism. So they kind of acknowledge like, oh, I'm going to be discriminated, right, based on something that I have no control over changing. And this is a big thing. It's happened. And so this propels them to sort of move quickly down this process. The immersion is where individuals explores their own Blackness. This oftentimes happens during college, right, when they're taking classes in African-American history, African-American literature. Okay. And at this point, they might want to avoid symbols of whiteness. They really need to be in that space with other Black people. Once they became secure in their own racial identity, they eventually come to a place where they have a positive sense of their racial identity is committed to social change. Now, this is, although this says, Black racial identity, when I talk about this in Japan, a lot of the Zainichi Korean groups or, Buraku, or the Buraku is not, exactly race, but people say, oh yeah, I went through the same stages. Okay. A Zainichi Korean woman told me once, yeah, I totally get this pre-encounter. When I was a kid, I refused to eat kimchi because I thought, if I ate kimchi, I'd become Korean. Okay, so there's this kind of fear. So, so I think, again, what I like about these two models is that, you don't see minority people in a monolith, right? You see people at different stages, right? And you can also have a general sense of empathy, right, towards the stages, and also think about, how do we get them to a different stage? Okay. So usually, if this was a live thing, I might do an activity, but this will be a pseudo activity. So some of you may already know this activity. It was on BuzzFeed, but it's a very simple game. Okay, you all represent the country's population, and everyone in the country has a chance to become wealthy and move into the upper class. To move into the upper class, all you must do is throw your wadded up paper in the bin while sitting in your seat. Okay, right? And I actually do this. This is like before COVID. So I teach this in a class of 200. I actually increased it to 460 lately because, but anyway, so yeah, so student. And I have students, write their name or some symbol so that some people, get it in, and I call out the students' names, okay, of those who and ask them to raise their hand if their names are called, because they, their paper balls got in. And right, it's always usually people in the first two rows, okay, and very few of the rest. And then I take the mic and I interview everybody from each row. So how did you feel like throwing this? Okay, and people in the front are like, oh yeah, I thought I could make it, or I'd be really like, embarrassed if I missed because of being so close. And so, and as we go in the back of the row, people say things like, oh, I probably, wouldn't make it, but I tried anyway, or I really stopped throwing because it's just, like, why throw it if you know you're not going to make it? So another thing that happens in these class activities is people in the back will say, Professor, this isn't fair. But I never heard people in the front row saying, Professor, this is, Sensei, this is unfair. So it's always the people in the back who raises the voices of, what's unfair. Okay. So, what is this activity trying to teach? Well, it's trying to teach the experience, right, of privilege, kind of experiential learning. What do the seats the students are sitting in represent? So this is the dominant, and subordinated identities. So people in the front are probably, have mostly dominant identities. And as you go to the back, the minority or the subordinated identity percentages increase. Also, I do ask, so what is the act of throwing, right? The throwing action that everybody does, like, what does that represent? And there's many different interpretations of that, but I also think that it's effort, right? So the person in the front who gets the ball in, right? It's not that, the person is just getting things automatically feeded and, having an easy life, right? The person still had to throw it. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that even though you may have a lot of dominant identities and you have a lot of privilege, okay, let's not discount the fact that, they also have worked a lot and they put in a lot of effort. But let's also still acknowledge that the amount of effort that one needs to succeed, right, could change, right? So people in the minority may have to work twice or three times as hard, right, to get to the front. The teacher concludes this exercise by saying, you are in a position of privilege to receive an education. Please use this privilege to help those who are sitting behind you. And I'm not sure if people remember that in 2019, Professor Emeritus Chizuko Ueno at Tokyo University of Tokyo gave a congratulatory address to the incoming, first year class. And so basically, she's saying here, to the Todai, right? Because these are the elite. This is like the Harvard, right, of Japan. That you may think that your hard work has landed you here, okay? But there are a lot of environmental factors and people around you who really helped you, encouraged you, pulled you up, praised you, right, to get to where you are. So please use that privilege to help people who don't have, those who weren't blessed with those environments and the abilities that you have. And I do remember that this was part of a huge controversy in Japan. Like this kind of blew up as like, how dare she say, this thing to, people who worked so hard. But I think if the students coming to Todai were aware of their privilege, if they had been educated about privilege awareness, okay, they would, listen to this going, is absolutely right, okay? That I have privilege coming here, and I'm going to use that privilege to, to better people who are less fortunate. So the takeaway here, I think, is that privilege is hard to see to those who have it. And another, I think, useful theory is a standpoint theory that comes from Sandra Harding, a feminist philosopher. She says, people who possess less power in society need to be and are aware and sensitive to the perspective of those who hold power over them. Those who are the most powerful in society are strongly motivated not to know a lot about the people they dominate and not to develop a sensitive understanding of the structures that preserve their power. So when we think about the standpoint theory, in terms of the exercise that we just went over, it's sort of like, who has the easier time seeing the larger structure, right? People in the front are only seeing that distance, right, from their seat to the bin. People in the back kind of see the whole view, and so oftentimes I think people who are in the front have to realize that, the more dominant identities you have, you may have more blind spots than anybody else. And I think knowing that and having that understanding will allow us to be more humble, okay? When people call us out, especially people with minority identity, saying, well, you kind of got that wrong, you see, we'll be open enough to go, yeah, I'm sure you're probably, right, because, I probably didn't see it, right? It's very hard for me to see that. So thank you for pointing that out to me. So, a Zainichi Korean sitting in the back might be, well, people at the front don't think of us in the back at all, and they are unaware of their privilege. Japanese person in the front is saying, well, I'm a good person. I don't discriminate towards others. I worked hard to get to where I am today, right? The question is, right, could there be, a dialogue on equal footing? I don't really think so. And then if there is no equal dialogue here, then how do you, get there? And I think my conclusion is, people in the dominant group have to change. You can't go on not understanding your privilege, right? You have to become aware, and that's when you could have a equal dialogue on equal footing. So this could be between, straight cisgender people and LGBTQ, or men and women, okay, on all different levels. So getting to a true dialogue, right, is those in a dominant group that needs to undergo this change transformation. They need to sort of, continue the journey in their identity development. Okay. Jun Ishikawa, who does disability studies, in his book, Invisible and Visible, he says, there's a strong assumption that there are many people who do not need special attention and a handful of people who need special attention. However, the correct view is that there are those who have already been provided for and those who have not yet been provided for who need special attention. So consideration for the dominant group is the default, and it's not named, right? Special attention. So in contrast, considerations for minorities are labeled as special attention. And so that's why, the fact that we're not naming all these things that we, sort of the default attention and I guess accommodation, maybe the word accommodation would have been better here, I'm thinking, but yeah, we do a lot of this accommodating for dominant groups, but we don't name it as accommodating. Okay. And I think, but we do it for minorities. We're like, well, this is an accommodation. This is, affirmative action, or this is, and then it becomes this whole like reverse discrimination, right? Kind of discourse that sort of happens. So that's why, again, right, we need to really make visible the invisible accommodations that are already being afforded to people in dominant groups. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna start going. Okay, so here's a So I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality, because this is a theme that I've been, grappling with more recently. So here's a quiz. In company A, half of the employees are Black and half are women. However, there are no Black women in the company. Well, what's going on there? So the answer is because all the Black employees are men and all the women employees are white. Yet, company A still managed to slip past the criteria for racism and sexism in a clever way. So this company could be basically like, hey, we don't discriminate against women or Black people because we have both of them. Okay, we have women and Black, but then the Black women falls through the cracks. And this actually is based on a true story at GM, General Motors. There were not a single Black woman before 1964, and all Black women hired after 1970 were fired during a restructuring that happened. And so these Black women sued GM, but the court says, well, the GM had, no sex discrimination and no, racial discrimination policies. So, you don't have a case here. Okay? And I think this is where sometimes people who have intersectional minority statuses fall through the cracks. And so I think what I'm trying to get at is, what happens, right? If you apply this to the Japanese university context, okay, what is going on here? So I, as a Japanese woman, right, benefit from, right, this push for hiring more women, right? Because my only subordinated identity is being a woman, okay? So it seems like, under the push for hiring more women, Japanese women get hired at a much higher rate. Under the push for hiring more non-Japanese, right, white men get hired in that place. And so I think we need to be aware that non-Japanese women, right, fall through the cracks, as well as those with multiple subordinate identities. Some people who might be a sexual minority, or some people with disabilities, right? So I think having that intersectional framework is really, really important as we think about, the hiring process, the promotion process that are happening currently in the Japanese university context. I also want to touch a little bit about my own personal context of, growing up as a racial minority in the United States, being a professor of color in upstate New York for, a number of years. And then coming back to Japan, right, in 2009 is when I came back. And I definitely, when I was in the United States, so I guess I would be considered, being a woman and a woman of color. So there's like two minority statuses. There's one thing that I definitely noticed is I was never considered to be somebody that would be of a leadership potential. And so I never thought of myself as having leadership potential, like ever. And I was never, given these opportunities. And I was just thought, well, that's fine. But once I came back to Japan, suddenly these doors like started really opening up for me. And I noticed, okay, this must be what white people like in the United States is experiencing, because I now I get it. So I really noticed that all these doors were opening for me. People suddenly were giving me leadership positions left and right. And and some of them are not necessarily I've earned them, right? I mean, there are definitely more people that should be qualified for these leadership positions. But suddenly, so I find myself, right, with these privileges. And so I just wanted to, talk about that. So it's kind of interesting when you're, when you are in that privileged position of being able to move back and forth between different contexts, and then that privilege becomes more salient. And I think maybe that is probably the case for many of you in the audience today. So I usually, want to end with, let's become allies. And also, once in a while, we should change up how we label educational topics. Like if you say, well, we're going to be talking about poverty and discrimination against women, okay, or homophobia, people who are not really interested in those issues might be like, well, that's really, I don't really have anything to do with that, so I'm not going to take those courses. Disability, I don't know, I'm really, I don't know, it's really not relevant to what I want to study, okay. So what I do in my classes often is instead of, because oppression and privilege and discrimination are the opposite sides of the same coin, sometimes I flip things. Let's talk about social class privilege. Okay? Let's talk about male privilege. Let's talk about heterosexual cisgender privilege. Okay? Let's talk about able-bodied privilege. And by changing the way we name topics, I think sometimes it makes it more interesting to people who normally might dismiss it. Okay. Also, it allows people to have a little bit of ownership and accountability. So something to think about. The daily practice is something that I encourage my students, instead of, when you see somebody, in a wheelchair, instead of thinking, oh, wow, that must be tough, navigating the subway, right? You can say, well, I have the privilege of being able to access the closest subway exit to me. Okay, it saves time. I have the privilege of not having to check ahead of time whether the station has a working elevator. Okay, so these are things that, that these like small little invisible things that if you make it visible to yourself, okay, I think it really helps to further, right, your understanding of how privilege works. Millie Hobson in her TED Talk, Colorblind or Color Brave, really calls for people to be able to sit, in uncomfortable situations. Okay? People who are of minority status are always getting used to, being in an environment where they are the minorities, they are the sole person of color or whatever. It's very uncomfortable, but but they can't escape that, right? That's their reality. Okay? So if you are a part of the dominant group, okay, the least you can do is learn, and by sitting in those uncomfortable discussions or privilege, discrimination, these are uncomfortable topics, especially if you haven't had them before. But at least try to be able to sit with the discomfort, because that's when learning is going to happen. Okay. There are 3 ways of being in terms of discrimination or racism. This is from Why Are All the Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria book. And I kind of took that into this moving walkway analogy. But so with all the different kinds of 3 forms of discrimination happening, right, society is kind of like a moving walkway towards social oppression. Okay? Even though individual people are good people with well-intention, right, we're still moving towards social oppression. People who are running in the same direction are the active racists. Like in Japan, it'll be the Zaitokugai, right? The people who are against Zainichi privilege. People who really think that Zainichi Korean people have more privileges than Japanese. Then there are people who are running in the opposite direction, trying to slow down this moving walkway. These are the active anti-racists. But then probably the most common person is the person just standing still and saying, well, I don't discriminate, I'm a good person. Okay? And this, I hate to say, I call a passive racist, because the person is not doing anything to interrupt oppression. Okay, so the person doesn't need to suddenly start, running and in the opposite direction. But at the least this person can do is to at least face backwards and take a small step. And if a lot of people do that, we really could ultimately change the censor, okay, in the sliding door analogy, okay, to make society more just and inclusive. Peggy Mcintosh, there's a great story about her allyship, which is that so her essay, White Privilege Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of 1988, the Harvard Educational Review caught attention of that and said, could we publish your article? And she says, wow, that's really amazing. Thank you. But I have one condition. If you're going to publish an essay about a white person having white privilege, then I really want you to publish, a person of color talking about how, they don't have white privilege. Okay. And the editors came back and says, well, we're really sorry. We don't have any space. Okay. So Peggy said, and she's now, used to these tactics, right? She's like, okay, fine. Okay. I understand. I will cut my article in half so that you can give the other half of my article space to the person of color. And the editors came back and said, well, we can't do that because that will affect the quality of our journal. Okay. And she ended up withdrawing her article, so it didn't appear in the Harvard Educational Review. But I thought, okay, this is what allies can do, right? Not just promoting your own self, okay, in a very prestigious journal, but bringing other people with you or demanding that space. okay, on behalf of people of minorities. Okay. So Francis Collins, Director of National Institute of Health. So he served as a director for 12 years. He actually announced that he's stepping down last month, but he pledged that he will not participate in panels featuring only men. Okay? And that was a big deal because especially in the field of medicine. And he says it's not enough to give lip service to equality. Leaders must demonstrate their commitment through their actions. Okay. So the Daisuke in 2019 Aichi Toreanare also did a similar thing where he made the male and female participating artists in the festival the same. Okay. And he was praised for that action. But a woman, woman said to me, if a female artistic director had said, well, we will increase the number of female artists to match the man, the response would probably not have been as positive. And so he says, I understand this means that I, as a man, is wearing very high getas or wooden sandals. Okay. And this is oftentimes what Japanese people seem to use. So because the word privilege isn't quite, in Japanese society yet. So a lot of people are using the word geta, wooden clogs, as a metaphor for privilege. So men wearing these high getas, so that's the amount that they are given privilege. And just the other day, this is November 4th, in Nikkei Woman online article, Marubeni Corporation announced that it aims for 50% women in the career track positions. So currently, 90% of the career track positions, are men. Okay, and so he's saying, but here he says in Japanese, 女性に下駄は履かせません. Okay, we will not, let women wear getas. Okay, so in a sense, he's saying it's not that we're giving women privileges or extra, something. We're going to treat women the same, equally as the men, giving them a fair chance. And so I thought, okay, well, things are changing, slowly, but this was one encouraging article. So it's not 50% right away; it's 50% like in a couple of years. But this is definitely and it kind of made me like go, oh yeah, I never even questioned this 90% career track because I'm so ingrained in this Japanese idea of like the career track is like some women can, are allowed spaces. But yeah, like what would be wrong with making that 50%, and isn't that the structural change that we need in Japanese society? Okay. So, people in dominant groups, again, like myself, right? I am often regarded as objective and neutral by my Japanese students. So when I talk about privilege and when I call them out on their privilege, they can kind of go, oh, maybe she's right. Maybe there's something to that. So I have the privilege of being regarded as objective and neutral, being part of the dominant group. And so I think, if we do have those kinds of privileges, we should use those privileges to further the education. Okay. So why do I teach about privilege? Well, it's because, people who have privilege have a hard time recognizing that for themselves, right? Did I know that I have privilege? No, I have to be taught about that. And so, so I think it's important to do this work. Okay. All the students that I teach at Sophia are like, why didn't anybody teach me about this when I was in junior high school or high school? Like, why did I have to come to Sophia and take this class, right, to learn about this? And I absolutely agree. This should be taught. And it's not even just about, being taught, because you go through a certain profession. Like, as a human being, I think, having this understanding will just make us a better people. So what is the ultimate goal of privilege awareness? Okay. I mean, it's nice to be aware of your privilege, yes, and you can think about going down the racial identity development model in stages. But I think ultimately, right, we want to change the censor. Okay, right? We need to change what is the censor? The censor is the institutional, cultural, and interpersonal discrimination that is holding, right, some people back, but allowing some people to go forward. Okay. And in order to change the censor, right, people in positions of power, right, should really take a lot of the lead. So whose responsibility is it, right, to teach Japanese people about Japanese privilege? Well, I think it's Japanese people who are aware of their Japanese privilege, like myself. So I am doing a lot of work, with Japanese teachers, Japanese corporations, more recently the Japanese government, okay, to educate us about that. And because of my position as a university professor, somebody who speaks English fluently, people pay attention, I feel. And so I'm finding that slowly I'm getting people to see this. And so, I'm sorry, I'm gonna skip the slide. This is from yesterday's slide, sorry. Yeah, so it's, what is the privileged conversation happening in Asia? Okay. So in May 2019, I took part in a privilege conference in Singapore, and the title was, Does Invisible Privilege Travel? Looking Beyond the Geographies of White Privilege. And this was a 2-day conference. I was there, Peggy Mcintosh was there, but all these scholars from, Asia, Southeast Asia, we're there to talk about, what is, and they're all from very different disciplines, but, using the construct of privilege to understand this. And so I think currently there are still remarkably few studies on privilege in Asia. Okay. And I guess I'm just going to read this part. While social tensions and inequalities are attributed to class privilege, it is striking that there is little academic research and literature on intersecting racialized forms of privilege. And so I think there's a lot of room also for research that we can engage in our future. So I'm going to end with this quote: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And this is a quote by African-American novelist James Baldwin. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention and participation. And I guess I'm sorry, I'm almost out of time. I'm happy to, go to a breakout session to, have a dialogue if people have questions. So thank you so much.
Thomas, if you could say a few words, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you very much, Daguchi Sensei, for your talk. Everyone, please give a round of applause.
Thank you.
You can see the chat is blowing up. There's plenty of questions for you to answer. We've got 2 minutes. Do we have time to take questions from the floor?
That's up to Wayne.
Okay, maybe we don't. Well, if I can ask one, because
Yep.
I've been checking out the questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and one question that struck me was about the terms that we use. So a lot of times terms are borrowed directly from Japanese, like Me Too. The hashtag Me Too was straight into English, excuse me, in Japan, where in other countries it was translated into that country's language. Whereas other things, terms are made in Japan, or there are terms that are originally in Japanese, like sabetsu, for example, for discrimination. What do you use in your classes, and what's your rationale for doing it? How do the students react?
Into the words sabetsu in particular, or do you mean like,
just in general? Do you use terms like, for example, intersectionality? Do you use like kosa tensei or something like that?
Yeah.
Or do you use terms that are Japanese, that are in Japanese?
I see. Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a great question that, but yeah, in terms of privilege, I think the word token, it was unfortunate that, it's been used, it's a name of, the word belongs to a name of a hate group in Japan. So,
yeah, Zaitokukai, yeah.
Yeah, Zaitokukai. So that was a kind of unfortunate, but I feel like if you look up, I've heard that if you do like a Google kensaku, a Google search, majority tokken in Japanese, you're going to get all these, privileges in terms of the social justice paradigm. And so I'm actually more hopeful than I used to be, because I thought, no one's going to really, catch on this word privilege. I don't think we necessarily have to use the word privilege, but I think it's catching on. I think people are starting to use it in the way that it's being used in the social justice paradigm. In terms of, sabetsu is a hard one, right? In the psychology literature, sabetsu, it's very, discrimination is a very specific term that, really means behavior. It's a behavior, right? It's different from prejudice and stereotypes. I think the division is not as clear in the Japanese language. And so I haven't, so I'm kind of glazing over them right now. But yeah, students seem to be okay with it. But yeah, I need to, you're right. I feel like I do need to, really try to have a clearer, a definition in the future for both contexts.
It would be interesting. And one other thing, another question that was in the Q&A was, do you get any pushback from the students, and how does it happen if you do, and what forms does it take, and how do you respond? Because probably like many of us in the audience, I myself do sometimes introduce these things, and sometimes either I sort of get implicit kind of students kind of looking at like, or I occasionally get an explicit pushback. Usually in Japan, you don't get explicit, but occasionally it does happen. I'm curious, what's your experience and how do you respond?
So you have to be, I think for me, because I have 14 weeks to teach about this. So I usually start with white privilege, because it's for the Japanese students, it gives them a distance, right? So if they can at least acknowledge that there is white privilege, and actually I haven't had a single student saying, I think Black people have more privilege, I have never gotten that pushback. And so they kind of accept that the construct, and then I slowly slide it into Japanese, but I usually start with social class privilege. That's the most easiest one, especially my students at Sophia. And so they kind of, ease into the idea. Okay, yes, I have social class privilege. Yes, I grew up in a family that going to college was the norm, right. And then I sort of get into the male privilege, which I get a lot of resistance from, and that's because I'm a woman. And this is the part where I wish a man would take over. Men are going like, I think you're just like mad, you just hate men or something, right? So I do get pushback in the male privilege segment, but I think the real the deep one. The male privilege is the misogyny is very deep too, but I think the Zainichi Korean discrimination stuff, like Japanese, that I really leave at the very end, to tackle that. And I spent a lot of time talking about that, because I think that's really when Japanese people go, well, I don't know, there's a gut sort of reaction of discomfort there. So I kind of take it in stages, but it's really important for me to establish my credibility, as a fair professor before tackling these. So, yeah, and when I was in the United States, that's another privilege I have in Japan, is that I can start day one with, hey, you guys have privilege. Whereas in the United States, I couldn't, start with white privilege. I had to always, establish my credibility for several weeks before I could even broach that subject as an Asian person, right? So that I definitely noticed, wow, it's so much easier to teach about privilege in Japan for, being part of the dominant group.
Thank you very much. And I really hope that you can, just speaking personally, I hope that you can write up some of this description of how of the stages through which you go through teaching these concepts, because a lot of us, maybe we don't have the training in our academic background, or we don't have the experience. I myself, obviously, a white American male. I experienced the disadvantage in Japan, as you mentioned, as a non-Japanese person, but I carry so many other advantages as well. So it makes me more aware of these advantages as well as the disadvantages on a not just an intellectual level. But I don't actually have that experience I don't have the training like you have as a social psychologist. So just speaking personally, I really hope you'll write this up.
Oh, wow.
It'd be really helpful for me and probably for many other people.
Okay, well, thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Just a step. Yeah, we're gonna have to close it down. So this is a great discussion, and one we really want to have. Actually, you can have a bit more of the discussion on Discord through our Discord server, where presenters are, and plenaries, they have a channel as well. People can go there, and you can get through the Discord server by going to the front page of the JALT 2021 conference site. You can do that as well. Also, yeah, you can, that's a really great place to go. And maybe Deguchi-san, if you're hanging about, you can go into the continuing discussions room, and people can maybe see you there as well if they want.
Could somebody just post the link maybe? With that, yesterday somebody posted a link, so I was able to go very easily. But well, it's okay. I can find it. I can probably find it. So this is
yeah. Don't worry. That's a very specific. That's the help/continued discussions room, is what that is.
Okay. So I need to find a Discord room.
Oh, Discord, you can go through the, hold on one second, maybe some fast fingers. Oh, there we go. Continue discussions room.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, I will go there. So thank you
You can
so
go
much.
check that out.
Okay, I appreciate it. So yeah, I can hang out until 11. So I'll see you there.
Okay, and we can put you in a room number 1.
Okay, room number 1. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your questions.